What is loneliness? The literature on loneliness tends to differentiate between emotional, social, and existential loneliness. There are many definitions, but broadly, emotional loneliness is where we lack close relationships, the people we trust most and confide in, like a loving partner. Social loneliness is where we lack a sense of belonging to a wider group or support circle, even if we have several close relationships. And existential loneliness, the one less talked about, is a sense of separation from other people, even if they're there, because we all experience the world in a different way. It's felt by everyone to an extent, but can be really intensified by things like disability, illness, or trauma. So who is lonely? Anyone can experience loneliness, and it's likely that we all will at some point in our lives. But the research suggests that certain groups are more susceptible to loneliness than others. There are older people, who we most often associate with loneliness, and evidence increasingly highlights young people's vulnerability, sometimes finding them more lonely than any other age group. Other characteristics associated with increased risk of loneliness include long-term illness, being mentally or physically disabled, being from Black, Asian or minority ethnic groups, being lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender or other identities, and many more. So why do people get lonely? A range of recent studies suggest a range of factors that might make us become lonely or worsen feelings of loneliness. For example, trauma, illness, bereavement, life transitions, unemployment, material deprivation, or social isolation, which is sometimes lumped together with loneliness, but it's just one possible cause and consequence of it. Depending on the cause of our loneliness, the experience can be transient or short-term, or it can be a chronic long-term feeling. So what's place got to do with all this? All this literature on the what, the who and the why of loneliness mainly sits in the social psychology field, framing loneliness on an individual level. It translates really well into responsive, targeted interventions for lonely people, which are fundamentally important, but it doesn't translate so easily into more structural, preventative approaches. And this is where place comes in. When we look at how loneliness is being addressed, very generally speaking, and there are exceptions, approaches tend to involve linking lonely people to opportunities and communities via a broker, whether this is a person, a service, a website or something else. This responsive work is absolutely critical, but because it's responsive and it responds to particular definitions and experiences of loneliness, there's only so much it can do. Attention to the where in loneliness has begun to appear in the mainstream literature and plays a key role in loneliness policy strategies across the UK, shifting emphasis from the individual towards place-based approaches to enabling and strengthening social connections through community networks, infrastructures, and public services. A body of primary research highlights the role of physical infrastructures in exacerbating or reducing experiences of loneliness. For example, the built environment, green and blue spaces, social spaces, transport, walkability, and increasingly digital infrastructures. Studies have also looked at the impact of social infrastructures of place, like community networks, social capital, cohesion, services and hubs, volunteering, neighbourliness, and a sense of community belonging and safety. When we bring place into the picture, it becomes easier to conceptualise a more structural and preventative approach, which, looking back to the why, addresses many, but not all, causes of loneliness at a more fundamental level, which feels like a very appealing, tidy and systemic solution. It's understandably sought after as a long-term, holistic policy approach to addressing this difficult issue. The much trickier, more complex question is how, or if, this might work in practice. So what would a preventative, place-based approach to loneliness look like? Returning to how loneliness is addressed, this has always been quite strongly rooted in place, but where physical and social infrastructures enable or facilitate these responsive interventions, whereas for the community infrastructures called for in policy strategies and wider literature, the role of place shifts from a landscape in which to respond to loneliness to a preventative landscape of community resilience or resourcefulness. These concepts loosely describe some kind of building up of strength or immunity, an ability to withstand challenges, but the specifics are very broad and contested, from definitions and interpretations of resilience as relocating responsibility for social issues, to emerging concepts of resourcefulness as relocating the resources needed to tackle them. All this makes the question of how to achieve a preventative approach to loneliness very difficult. And it also leads to wider questions around not just how this structural approach might work, but if it would work at all. In the literature, the concept of community resilience is often tied up in ideological debates around volunteerism, localism, and the big society, which are sometimes argued to support neoliberal state retreat and austerity, locating responsibility, but not resources, at a community level. So, holding up the status quo, rather than addressing any of the structural causes underlying issues like loneliness. There's also a wide and diverse body of literature arguing that local community action fundamentally challenges the status quo and promotes radical, systemic change, reframing how issues are conceptualised and addressed and services delivered to tackle structural inequalities. And reality is no doubt a messy cocktail of all of this, depending on diverse structures, politics, purposes and circumstances. So there's where the literature and policy around loneliness talks about going, and some questions around how and whether such a preventative structural approach might actually work. And then COVID happens. When COVID happens, the landscape changes, and therefore so does how we experience space, which has particular relevance for this discussion of the role of place in preventing loneliness. On the one hand, we're more stuck in space. We feel absolute geographical space more intensely. Where we live, from the mould on our walls to the community outside them, has suddenly become even more significant than before. But at the same time, for some of us, space also feels more fluid and relational than ever before, because of the digital networks we're able to, choose to, or forced to engage with. So where does all this leave the goal of a preventative approach to addressing loneliness through community infrastructure? And this is where our research comes in. This new landscape provides two opportunities. The first is to do with the if. Community infrastructure is lit up and buzzing, as it often is in times of crisis, which provides an opportunity to look at how it's working. Stuck space, people being locally present, and fluid space, the digital and online sphere, are all playing into this, and we want to unpick what's going on here and the implications for addressing loneliness. Is this sticky plaster stuff? Is it challenging the status quo? Or both? And the second opportunity is to do with the how. Because of stuck space, loneliness is worse, and linking lonely people to opportunities and communities has become really difficult. And because of fluid space, there's been this huge digital shift in terms of developing new approaches. And again, we want to unpick what's going on here. Are we seeing responsive approaches repackaged in digital spaces? Or is there something new or different happening? And in trying to unpick all this, the role of communities and technology in addressing loneliness, our research aims to identify what effective community infrastructures might look like, how they can be enabled, sustained and enhanced. Ultimately, opportunities and challenges in achieving this loop back from the where to the why of loneliness, this long-term structural change. We'll keep you posted with the findings of the research. Keep an eye out on our website or click subscribe below, then the bell to get an email when new videos are released.